Hi, everybody. Good morning. Hope you guys are doing well. I guess we're getting kind of used to all this Zoom stuff. Everyone logs on at exactly the same time. Either that or we're clairvoyant. Well, this is our last class today. You guys made it through your first quarter. Congratulations. I know that you guys have a presentation tomorrow in Cog Lunch, I saw. Is that correct? What fun. Yeah, I hope you we're told that this isn't anything serious. We just kind of want to, meet you folks and learn what your background is and what your research interests are. We don't expect you to have done a lot of research at this point, but hopefully you've been communicating with your advisors and talking about different projects you're planning on doing and things like that. And that's all we expect. You guys were told that, right? It's very casual tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. Good. Are there any questions about that? No, you guys seem pretty laid back. Good for you. Cool. Okay, we can talk a little bit about the, since this is our last meeting, we can talk a little bit about the test, the final, and the final paper. Just so you know the big picture, I need to have everything completed by Thursday of next week. And the reason for that is because they've actually pulled back the grading due date a day. So it makes things a little bit more complicated. Typically it's a Tuesday after finals week, but now it's the Monday after finals week. And so I'm trying to think if there's something I can do for you folks. Yeah, I have to have your, okay, let's say this. I have to have your tests by Thursday night. I want to start grading your tests by Friday morning. But I could certainly, if you want to wait until Monday for the paper, we could do that Monday morning. So let's do it that way. I have this other class, and I'm trying to think how I can coordinate my grading, given that everything is due on Monday. I think that if you guys get your tests in, let's say by 9 o'clock Friday morning. So if you're a night owl, you can certainly do it that Thursday night if you want. So 9 o'clock Friday morning, I'd like your exams, and your exam format is going to be exactly the same as the last one. You're given 4 hours, it's take home, it is closed book, you have that little thing you need to sign, but it's the same format as well with regard to the layout of questions. So, there's some definitions and short answer, and then it works its way up to the essay, and there'll be one essay question. So that's the same format as the first exam, the midterm. With regard to that paper, again, this is supposed to be something very straightforward for you. It is like a part 4 question on your test. So it's an integrated question, but it is a question that you can address over, say, 3 to 5 pages at the very most. It's not designed to be more than 3 pages, but that can be open book, so you can cite sources and things like that. So it can be a more complete answer than you would normally give on an exam, since you can use all the materials from the course or from outside the course. Everything is game. Of course, just so that this is clear, all the plagiarism restrictions apply here. I certainly don't want you, copying large passages or anything like that and putting it into your paper. I assume you know that. Sometimes people haven't gone through plagiarism as undergraduates. If you have any questions, look it up in terms of how to use other people's passages in writing. We had a problem with that a number of years ago. I just want to make sure you folks are very clear on that. But assuming you are, yeah, it's something that's really there to, just boost your grade a little bit. Most people get pretty near full credit on the take-home question. So I will give you the take-home question probably sometime in the next few days, and it will be due 9 a.m. Monday morning, the day after finals, or Monday after finals. And then I'll finish your full exam probably by Friday this week. So I'll send it to you Friday. So that will give you almost a full week to study and take the exam when you're ready. Okay. Are there any questions on the exam or the take-home question?
So we can turn in either of them.
Okay. Hold on just a second. Okay, go ahead, Hunter. I'm sorry, I have my volume down.
I was just going to clarify. We can turn them in whatever order we'd like.
Oh, I still have my volume. I'm sorry. Hold on just a second. Just a second. Still not able to hear you, but I'm pretty sure it's my fault. Let's take a look here. Sorry about this.
Can you hear me?
There we go. That should take care.
I can hear you.
Oh boy. Now my computer's sleeping. Hold on just a second. It's a little slow here. Just give me a second to turn this on. I apologize. We've been pretty lucky with technical stuff. Wow, it's very strange. Okay.
I don't care.
Sorry about this, everybody. Ugh. Okay. My computer ain't behaving very well right now. So I couldn't audio. Oh, sorry, everybody. Okay, Hunter, give it a try now.
Hello.
There we go. I'm sorry about that. I can hear you now.
It's okay. I had a really dumb question, but I just want to make sure because we can turn those in either order, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I can
yeah,
turn
I
in
mean,
the paper first if I want.
Yeah, it's just the very latest date I'm giving you, so I have time to grade it. Yeah, whenever. I mean, I know you guys have other tests, and if you certainly want to get this done before you have to study for your other tests or take your other tests, that's fine. Don't worry about it. You know, I usually grade everything together so I can go through the questions one by one. So I probably will wait till everybody turns theirs in. And so you probably won't get your grades on the individual items until Monday, but you can turn it in anytime you want. Okay.
So it's due on the 18th?
Okay, let me look at a calendar. I'm sorry about this.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Yes, so if you want to write down the dates, your exam will be due at 9 a.m. on the 18th, and your take-home paper will be due on the 21st at 9 a.m. Okay, so I'm you know, kind of anticipating when I'm going to wake up and start grading them. So those would be the times. So the exam, the final exam will be due the morning of the 18th, 9 a.m. on the 18th. The take-home paper will be due at 9 a.m. on the 21st. And that will give you guys a little bit more flexibility. I want you folks to have more flexibility than the undergrads, that's for sure. Okay. Other questions on that? Other questions on the exam or the take-home question or anything like that? No? Okay.
Yeah, I have one more question. You mentioned in the last class about making sure and reading the paper on, I think it was self-complexing systems.
Yes. Was that assigned for this lecture or?
Oh, no, it was just like a suggestion.
Well,
but I was wondering what paper that was, because there's not one like titled self-complexing, but
oh, there is.
Is that just any of the connectionism, like?
Yeah,
papers?
is there nothing on self-complexity? You know, there might be something on self-complexity at the end of the computer computational approach lectures. You
Okay.
take a look at that. And if not, I used to certainly assign something. You know, I do change the readings every few years. So it could be I took it off for some reason. Was there a particular issue that, do you remember what did I say something about? What was the context where I said that? Do you remember offhand?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I just wrote down, make sure and read self-complexing systems. And then I was trying to find like, okay, well, which one is that exactly? And maybe I was looking in the wrong week.
No, it could be that I took it off.
Week 7.
I can certainly put something back on. So what did you think? Was there anything even close to that in the reading list? No.
The O'Brien paper, and
Yeah.
I mostly just looked at all the like connections.
Yeah, the connectionist stuff. Yeah, I think they allude to self-complexing, but I can certainly put something back in. Okay. let me take a note on that and remind me if I forget. Yeah, that's no problem. I apologize.
No.
Okay. Yeah, I'll put that back in.
And I know you covered it pretty thoroughly in class, so.
Yeah, but
I
if
just
I said you should take a look at it, then maybe there was a part of it that I went through a little bit quicker. So I should make sure I put that up. So, but again,
according to my notes on November 17th, I wrote read for the final self-complexing systems.
okay.
So I don't know.
It's very simple for me to post something on that. That's no problem.
It's been almost a month since I wrote that, so I'm kind of like,
fine.
Who knows what I meant?
Yeah. Your guess is as good as mine. So yeah, I'll certainly post something on that. That's no problem at all. Other questions? And I should mention, if you folks, before you start the exam or the paper, before you see the paper's question, if you have any questions to help study, I'd be happy to do it. What I don't want to do is have you open up the paper, and then ask me about information on that paper. So, if you want to wait and meet with me beforehand, just make sure you haven't opened either thing. Okay. But I'm happy to meet with you anytime between now and the time you take the test and then write the paper. Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay, let's get at it then. And we're starting to talk about, I think, one of Gibson's most provocative concepts here. We left off at looming perception. And let's kind of step back and look at the big picture with Gibson. We just trying to, there's this, okay, we'll see if that works. There's this big thing that Zoom has, this kind of big, graphic control panel thing that completely takes up a good portion of the slides, so it's hard for me to look at the slides. I think it's okay now. I assume you guys can't see it. Anyway, okay, so the big picture with Gibson was that he was trying to establish perceptual psychology where he kind of put the onus on the scientists to look at the input information and whether it was in some ways sufficient so that a lot of mental process needed to be done. So that's kind of the way of looking at this. Gibson's going to suggest that before we kind of turn to mental process, mental enhancement, mental embellishment, to kind of build up our perceptual experience, our perceptual world, and by extrapolation, our psychological world, can we rethink what the input might be like to show that there's a lot more information available. And in doing so, he's going to anticipate kind of a reconceptualization of what the job description for the nervous system is like, rather than it being something that kind of derives our experience. It's something that kind of resonates to what he'll call specificational information, fully informative input, and kind of react to that. And we'll talk about resonance a little bit later, but you'll get the idea. Rather than a process of creating our experience, it's an example of kind of detecting the information that is kind of driving our experience. So he's going to say, let's not give up on the input. With all these theories that we've been discussing, the structuralists, gestaltists, connectionists, computationalists, of course, there was kind of an assumption about the bare bones of the input, and that came from these kind of barriers to realism. And what Gibson's saying is, let's rethink what the input might be, and not only see how it might be informative about what's in the world in a trustworthy, lawful manner, but also, and this is what we're going to get into now, a meaningful manner. Can we show that the information isn't just telling us kind of general environmental states of affairs, but actually telling us something about our relation to it? So for meaning to be, useful to the animal, it has to tell the animal not only what's out there, but what's out there relative to what's offered the animal. It's one thing to perceive a chair, right? It's another thing to perceive what behaviors that chair allows. And so this comes from his 79 book and his writing after. It wasn't something kind of suggested, well, it was kind of hinted at in his 1966 book a little bit, but it really wasn't fully fleshed out until the 79 book, the book he wrote right before he passed. It is often considered, again, one of the more provocative ideas behind Gibson. And it's interesting, you know, when you learn about Gibson in other classes, or, you know, undergraduate perception class, maybe the courses you'll be taking as grad students now, very often they leave this part out. And this part is in some ways the philosophically most important part of the theory. It's the idea that meaning can be derived from the input information without referring to the animal's intention, the animal's desires, the animal's representation. So how do we get meaning without representation? And for Gibson, he turned to an idea called affordances. Okay, there we go. Affordances. So what are affordances? Affordances, just very briefly, are the sorts of actions that the things in the world allow the animal to perform. Okay, we'll get into this. I see on my slide. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail. But you know, like apple, as you see there, is going to afford different sorts of behaviors. It's going to afford grasping. It's going to afford throwing. It's going to afford eating. And for Gibson, that is the most important part of perception. The idea that we categorize things either based on their sensations or based on, you know, even what the you know, kind of object category is not important, as important, at least for Gibson, when it comes to understanding the objects of perception. The objects of perception for Gibson are what things allow an animal to do. So that's the big goal here for Gibson, is we perceive meaning. So he said, let's, you know, before we you know, kind of assume there's a set of processes that need to go from the sensation, you know, up through representation and the processes on representation that then allow the animal to apply meaning through some sort of, you know, computation or any sort of mental processing. Let's just kind of keep that as the big goal and not make assumptions about anything else in the process. Let's just say that's what the goal of perception is. That is what we need to explain, okay, before we explain anything else, is meaning. So affordances, you know, when we're talking about objects in the world, we're not talking about how a chair is classified as a chair, but instead how a chair is one of the items that affords certain behaviors, such as sitting. Okay, so we don't categorize. So for Gibson, a dollhouse chair and a you know, full-size chair, or the biggest chair in the world, which happens to be, if you're interested, though at least the biggest wooden chair in the world is in Binghamton, New York, because that's where I went to college. It is not actually, you know, I mean, we can categorize those things as chairs kind of abstractly, but in terms of the behaviors they allow, they are not part of the same class, okay? On the other hand, what are part of the same classes are chairs and maybe stumps and maybe, you know, low profile tables, and looking around my garage here, couches and bikes and things like that. These are all things that invite a very specific behavior, and that's sitting. Okay. So affordances, then, we've said this, are behaviors allowed by objects. They are, importantly for Gibson, the objects of perception. Those are the things that the perceptual function must recover, okay, before anything else. Before anything else. So this is really kind of an important notion that, again, before we categorize something as a chair, we categorize things as allowing the behavior of sitting. Before we categorize something as you know, a ball or an apple or something like that, we categorize these things into things we can grab. So we're talking about very, very fundamental sorts of behaviors, right? And, you know, Gibbs is saying that's what animals are perceiving. That's what our doggies and kitties and all sorts of, you know, animals from the, you know, kind of most simple to the most complex. That is kind of the fundamentals of the perceptual object, is what behaviors are allowed by objects. And so all these other things that, you know, we've kind of classified as with regard to illusions and pictures and all that sort of stuff really is very much secondary and not what the perceptual psychologist should be trying to explain. The perceptual psychologist should be trying to explain perception in the service of action, in the service of, you know, supportive behaviors. And that should be the driving sort of issue for both kind of conceptual development of a theory and methodological development in the laboratory. Okay. Now this is where, you know, kind of we're going to turn now to this idea of making the ecological approach more ecological in the laboratory. We talked about bringing in aspects of the environment and testing it in the laboratory that allows us to determine what the relevant information is, what this rich and relevant information is. But here's the other move in the laboratory. Let's not ask people to classify objects as abstract objects. That should not be the task. The task should be to ask people what different sorts of objects and, you know, layout of objects allow in terms of behavior. Okay. So the task is going to be much more asking people what they can do in the laboratory than what they see in the laboratory or what they, you know, hear, etc. Okay. So the affordance idea, just maybe even on a first pass, is going to drive methodology, as we'll see. Okay. This is a really important notion. Affordances critically are not just defined by what an object's like layout is, right? It's also going to be defined by the animal. But this is critical. It's not defined, when we say just defined by the animal, it's not defined by the mental state of the animal, the representational content of the animal, the intent of the animal. Instead, it's just defined by the animal's kind of gross anatomy, its dimensions, its you know, what its body can do. So this idea of affordances being defined by the animal is clearly not like, you know, we'll get to this later, but the notion of the Gestaltist invitation characteristics, where a mailbox doesn't invite mailing if that's not what the animal wants to do. Want for Gibson has nothing to do with how he's going to determine what an affordance is for a given animal. It's just the behavioral potential, regardless of the intent of the animal. Okay. And it is defined by the dimensions of the object and the dimensions of the animal. Okay. So, for example, that chair there might not afford sitting for my pet elephant, right? You know, it's probably going to crush it. It probably couldn't get its backside onto the chair whatsoever. But it is going to afford sitting for my pet Chihuahua, who always wears a red sweater. Okay, and it affords sitting for us, clearly. So to talk about what the object of perception is going to be determined not only by, you know, the object's dimensions, the fact that it does in fact have a flat surface that could support some weight but not others. It's going to be defined by the dimensions of the animal as well, right? I don't know, there's certain things that we can't reach because we're only, you know, so tall and that sort of stuff. And it's not going to, you know, the top of the leaves at the top of the tree aren't going to afford grabbing for me because I can't jump up there and reach them, but they are going to afford grabbing in the giraffe's mouth because it has that sort of dimension. So that is an affordance for a giraffe, but not me. The chair is an affordance for me and the Chihuahua, but not my pet elephant, Elsie. Okay. hopefully you get the idea. And we'll talk more about this in just a second, because it's going to prove to be a very important notion for how to describe the way affordances might be available in the input information, right? Remember, that's going to be the absolute restriction for Gibson. Whatever we think is the goal of perception, the object of perception, the properties that are being perceived, they have to be shown to be available in the input information. So we're going to have to talk later about how affordance information is available in the light and the sound and all that sort of thing. Okay, so you can see how this is going to get provocative, because where in a sense Gibson wants there to be meaning in the light. Okay, and he wants there to be a way of describing meaning and meaningful interactions without the animal's addition of any sort of intent or anything like that. So it is provocative. But let me just give you a very simple example of how this can be set up in the laboratory. It is kind of one of the kind of most known moves of Gibson, that he kind of makes the methodology, kind of environmentally relevant, as well as the stimulus environmentally relevant. And there's a I don't know, 30-year history showing 30 to 35-year history of people doing these sorts of experiments. And we've done some in our lab I'll talk about later on, but these are what are called sometimes affordance experiments. And if you go through, some of your major perception and cognition journals, you'll see this sort of methodology used often these days, where you ask people, rather than to judge say dimensions of objects, abstract dimensions of objects, you ask them to judge whether or not they can perform different behaviors with regard to those objects. So is this a chair that can be sat on? Is this an object that can be grabbed from your position? And these are just what's called sometimes an affordance methodology, where the emphasis is on what behaviors are allowed by things that are presented in the laboratory. So this is one of the first ones, one of the earliest ones. I think this is from the earlier mid-'80s, having to do with stair climbing. And the notion, before we get into this, is that when you ask people to make these judgments of objects, or collections of objects, you make the affordance judgments, you find some interesting regularities in both perception and action that would not be revealed if you had a more classic methodology. So you could, say you're interested in how people perceive relative height or something like that. Yes, historically you could ask people to, try to make judgments and looking at images or real objects, and have them make judgments in inches or meters, or you can, make it a little less, kind of extrinsically measured, and say which of these two things is taller, that sort of thing. And you can certainly get results that way. But what would happen instead if you asked a behaviorally relevant task in the laboratory? Is that going to reveal, again, regularities that you might not see with other sorts of methodologies? So this is the stair climbing methodology. And this was Bill Warren, a student of Gibson. What he did is he asked people to look at stairs whose riser height could be adjusted, and just to judge whether or not these are stairs that they could climb. My old gym, I haven't been to a real gym in over a year now. Well, not quite a year, but my gym's now in the garage. But my old gym had one of those Stairmasters that were for rehabilitation. And so, most Stairmasters have these little paddles that you step on. This was an actual set of stairs on a treadmill. I don't know if you've ever seen these sort of things. But typically they're reserved for rehabilitation, things like that. I'm sure they're very expensive and kind of very specialized. But they had one because I went to the UCLA rehabilitation gym, and what you could do with those stairs is, of course, you could set the speed and the resistance and all that stuff, but you could also set how tall each step was. So I think there was a little thing you could turn, and all the steps would kind of grow a little bit. That's called the riser height. So okay, so there is a step right there, and you could make that riser height more or less tall depending on the sort of the sort of workout that the person wanted to do for rehabilitation purposes. So that's what he used. He used something like this, kind of an older version of it. But he brought this to the laboratory, and he would adjust this for each trial and ask people whether that riser height was still low enough that they could step on the treadmill without having to use their hands or something like that. Okay, so I'm looking around. You can't see this, but I have a little table here that's about the height of, I don't know, about midway through my thigh. It's just a little coffee table, end table thingy. And that might be one of the stairs. I mean, it's a very tall riser height, and people would be asked, can you step on this treadmill with these very high steps without using your hands? And people would look at it and say, no, that's too high. I'd have to use my hands. I don't think I could do that at all. And then he'd have ones, of course, that were much lower, and people say, oh, yes, and yes. And what he was after on this first experiment was, what is the highest riser height, the highest height of each step that people can climb, and can they perceive their ability to do so? And so he show stairs after stairs after stairs, and people would make judgments. I don't think I can. Yeah, I think I can. I don't think I can. And then after they were all done, he would actually measure their legs and actually try to step on these, so he had the actual kind of the true stairs that people could climb, the highest step that people could climb. And what he found, maybe not completely surprisingly, is that people were absolutely outstanding at this. They were nearly perfect. And that's what this is showing here. One of these lines is, I can't remember which is which, but one of these lines is showing the perceived stair height, and one of these is showing the actual stair height that they could judge. And I think this is just percentage. Yes, I can climb it. And this is the riser height or the leg length. I think one of these measures might be a leg length. And I mean, the first, of course, kind of thing to notice here is that people are, nearly perfect at doing this. They are, almost exactly correct when it comes to judging whether or not they can climb a step, given its height. Much more accurate than they would be if they were asked to say, can you judge this step in I don't know, feet or inches or something like that. And even more accurate than if they're asked to judge whether these things are the same or different. And that's interesting as well, that when you kind of couch the methodology into a behaviorally relevant task, that people become, like almost perfect. They're not great at judging abstract dimensions of things, but they are very good at judging behaviorally relevant things. That's the first thing. The other thing is that it turned out that even though clearly different people would have different abilities to climb stairs depending on how tall they are, depending on their leg length, that they all ended up with the same metric ultimately. So clearly, Shaquille O'Neal can climb a set of stairs that has a riser height that's much bigger than little Rosenblum, okay? I'm a pretty short guy, and I've got pretty short legs on top of that. You can't see that, fortunately, because of Zoom. But, Shaquille probably can climb a set of stairs that's almost my full height. I mean, he's a huge guy. I don't know if you've ever seen him in person, but I have for a couple of times, and he's a huge guy. And so he would certainly be able to climb stairs that I wouldn't, and he'd be able to perceive that. But the interesting thing is that for both of us, the tallest riser height, the tallest step that we could climb, is the exact same proportion to our leg length. And that's what actually this is showing, that both of us have the ability to perceive the fact that we can climb a stair as high as 88% of our leg length. And that's leg length measured from the hip bone, can't see this, the hip bone down to the bottom of the sole, the floor, I guess. And for both Shaq and me, we can both climb a step that's 88% of that distance. Okay, and that's exactly the same. And it turns out to be the same pretty much for everybody, you know, as long as their limbs are working fine and all that sort of thing. So it absolutely scales to leg length. And it seems that that's something that we're able to perceive just by looking at stairs through the first part of the experiment. And the second part of the experiment from that same paper had to do with metabolic efficiency. And so in the second task, people were shown, I guess Warren had two sets of these stairs where the riser heights could be adjusted. And they weren't asked what's the tallest riser height that could be stepped on, but which is easier to climb. So, you know, he, you know, made sure that all these stairs were actually within the climbable range. So they were all less than 88% of the leg length, right? And they were shown to and say, which is easier to climb? And people would make judgments. Now, you may have encountered in your travels, when you go to campus, you can see this too. In fact, the stairs that, I think we talked a little bit about this, that art building, the kind of, you know, very kind of, you know, conspicuous building at the front entrance of campus, has all these like little brinks that we talked about as we were discussing the brinks. Some of these things, I don't know if they're necessarily designed for steps, but some of them are very, very high and they can be climbed. Other ones you have to kind of, you know, kind of push yourself on. I guess they're not designed as stairs, but you can kind of traverse it. The same, there's a kind of an area of the commons, the same sort of thing. And, you know, you can take big steps and kind of walk up it, but you know that is not a very metabolically efficient stair to use. Here, let me get this metabolic efficiency. That you couldn't do this for a long period of time, right? So you can't traverse a set of stairs that has a very high step height for any major period of time. You just get too tired. On the other hand, I don't know if you've ever encountered very short steps. Sometimes in old architecture, they have that at the Acropolis in Athens. When you go up the steps towards the temples, the steps are very, very short. And I think there's a kind of a visual architectural reason for that. They wanted to kind of make, according to, you know, art historians, they wanted to make the stairs kind of seem like they were flowing out of the temples or something like that. And it looks beautiful, but it is not a very efficient stair to climb. You're kind of doing this sort of thing up the stairs and you get very tired. So it's kind of the other end, where both the high step height and the very low step height are not metabolically efficient stairs for us. There is a metabolically efficient stair for each of us, and it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And the question is it something that we can perceive? And, you know, anticipating where we're going today, yes, it's amazing how good we are at this. And so, yeah, people first make these judgments, these perceptual judgments, and then they take people, put them on the treadmill and try different riser heights and record their metabolic I guess, state as they're climbing the different riser heights. And that's what this second image over here is showing. So I guess they're recording respiratory rate and heart rate, and the question is, which step is best, right? And you know, that is going to be different for everybody. It's going to be different for Shaq than it is from me, but it's the same type of thing again, where it's the same proportion of our leg length that's going to determine this. And that is absolutely true as the scientist is able to record it. And it's absolutely true as far as our perceptual systems can detect this information. And so this is just showing the optimum riser height for tall people and short people, you know, kind of grouped into two different groups in the experiment. And as it turns out, just in case you're ever asked this on Jeopardy, the most metabolically efficient stair for a person to climb is about 1/4 of their leg length, again, measured from the hip bone down to the floor. And that's true of Shaq. the quarter of his leg length might be something like this, and it's true for me, where the quarter, maybe it's not that bad, is something like Shaq's is probably like this. I'm like this, but it's still a quarter of the leg length. And it's interesting that, again, that it does have a kind of consistent ratio between the step height and the leg length across individuals. But it's also interesting that people are so good at picking this out, and it's not like they need practice. They don't get feedback at this or anything, right? And imagine, and I can speak from some experience, just so you know, what we do in our lab. You bring people in and ask them to make affordance judgments, and they're a little surprised about this, that they think they're not going to be making judgments that are kind of behaviorally relevant. And they say, this is a strange thing to do at first. And then you ask them to do it, and they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, I can do this, no problem. We did an experiment years ago where we were interested in auditory distance perception. And so there's a literature on auditory distance perception suggesting that we're not very good at judging the distance of sound sources. That we overestimate in some places and underestimate in other places if we're asked to make judgments in meters or inches or something like that. But we did in our experiment, we just asked people to make judgments of whether or not they could reach a sound source. So they were blindfolded. We had a kind of mechanical rattle that was shaking an object that had, I think, paper clips inside, like that sort of sound. And people sat kind of in their chair, relaxed with their back to it. And we kind of moved the object closer and further away. We said, can you reach this object? Can you reach this object? And at first it seems like an odd task, but after a while they say, oh, this is very simple. And they make judgments, they make very consistent judgments. And then afterwards we do measure what they can and can't reach. And people were amazing. They were absolutely, nearly perfect. In fact, in a follow-up experiment, we did the whole thing visually, and people were as good at making those judgments auditorily about whether or not they could reach a sound source as if they were making them visually. And again, it's kind of surprising from the perspective of classic auditory distance perception research, where people were suggested not to be good. You put it in a context where they're asked to do something behaviorally relevant, and bam, they're great. They're nearly perfect and very, very consistent, which is cool. So this is the sort of methodology that this kind of brings. And once you have people kind of performing like this with such consistency, you can start to look for other aspects of how it might be done. Are there kind of critical ratios between body dimensions and object dimensions and stuff like that? And that's a very useful thing to do. Once you allow people to kind of really perform in the way that their perceptual systems have likely developed to perform, right? Then you can find other regularities as they found in this experiment. So there's a huge literature on this. I'm just kind of giving you a few examples. Okay, but here's the real issue for Gibson. And that is the information for affordances. Remember, it's one thing to show that people are exceptional when it comes to making perceptual judgments in the context of natural behavior. That is a big move. It really, that has revolutionized methodologies for perceptual psychology. It's important. But that is certainly not enough for Gibson. What Gibson wanted to show is that there's a way now of explaining what's going on without there being mental representation. And the first thing, when you hear about affordance experiments and you're not aware of this aspect of Gibson's theory, you're thinking, well, it must mean that when people, in these affordance experiments, and people are making good judgments based on their body, they must have a very, very good detailed representation of their body dimensions. Okay, they have a great body schema, right? And they're somehow making comparisons between the visual information they're getting in and the representation of their body. And that is certainly, I think, what many computationalists and folks would say. But Gibson's saying, Again, let's see if there's something in the information so we don't have to, require the animal to have a body schema, an internal representation of the body. See, this is radical, right? Let's see if there's information for the world relative to the body in the light. Okay. So what Gibson wants to show is that if there's information for things in the world available in specificational information in the light, then there should also be information about the body relative to the world in the light. Okay. And if so, then this notion, this kind of provocative statement that there's meaning in the light might make a little bit more sense, right? It might make a little bit more sense. So one thing we need to kind of now remember, we need to kind of bring up again, is the idea of the ambient optic array and visual solid angles. Remember how Gibson defined how light is going to provide information, right? So remember visual solid angles, I think we talked about that last class, where the optical information was defined by the reflected light from surfaces in the world, but also an apex of this angle that was at a point of observation. And in that sense, the point of observation, not even occupying it now, not putting a brain in there, but that point of observation is going to be one of the things that structures the light, in that it's defined relative to a very specific position. Okay. So when you're looking at the information available to an eye, you need to account for how light is reflected, but where the light is reflected to. That is part of the structured information. Okay. So what Gibson says is that let's think about how an eye looks at the environment. And an eye looks at the environment from a very specific position. And that position is going to have an effect on how the light is structured, in a sense, or how that light, how the structure, I guess, is sampled, maybe is a better way of saying it. So it is determined by the animal and the environment, right? So it's again, we're defining the stimulus as being something that's taking into account where the point of observation is. And for animals, there typically is a relationship between eye height and leg length. Before I say that, let me step back. Here's Rosenblum. Okay, since I've been talking about Rosenblum and Shack, here's Rosenblum looking at it, and here's Shack. All right. I don't think my legs are that much shorter than Shack's. Well, they probably are. It is amazing how big this guy is. I don't know, you probably get a sense from TV, but when I'll just tell you the story. He lives in LA, I think now, pretty much. When my son was born, his daughter was born. It was the same day at the same hospital. And I was walking around. I think I was getting my wife a drink or something like that in the hallways. And this little girl comes out and she says, "Hey, have you seen Shaq yet?" She was like 5, 6 years old. And I said, "Shaq?" I said, "No." And I don't know who you're talking about. She said, "Oh, Shaq's here." I said, "Okay." I thought maybe it was one of her cousins or something like that. I have no idea. And then I continued to walk down the hall, and there he is coming the other way, kind of with his entourage. And I mean, he's like a mountain. I mean, it's just, he's immense, not just in terms of his height, but, he's a very strong guy too. Seems like a real sweet, saying hi to everybody, and was really happy because of his daughter. It was very sweet. And I said to I went back to the room. And I said, "Oh my God, I saw Shaq, and I think our newborn son could fit in his sneaker, and maybe we can ask him for one and bring him home in it or something." But I mean, he's immense. So think about us. Think about little Rosenblum and big Shaq looking at the world. And yeah, we could look at the same scene. We could be standing next to each other, and maybe we're looking at our wives and children. Okay, and there we are. The way I see that scene is different from the way Shaq sees the scene. And we can talk about, there's lots of differences between that, right? But let's get to the most fundamental. And the most fundamental is, say, we're looking at our wives and children out, on a big field with a tree, and there is the horizon behind it. Where the horizon kind of bisects the scene is different from where the horizon for Shaq than it is for me. Okay, where the horizon kind of intersects the scene for me is lower in the kind of layout of objects here than where it is for Shaq. And that's something that's going to happen whenever, across Shaq's lifetime and my lifetime. And yeah, this is a very, very kind of clear, conspicuous example of where the horizon is. But even if we're not seeing the absolute horizon, where kind of the vanishing point and all that, when we come upon different surfaces, say, indoor textures on a ground plane, tables, that sort of thing, where things are kind of bisecting other things from the same side of looking at things is going to be different for Shaq than it is for Rosenblum. And the difference is going to be dependent on our eye height, right? And also that eye height is going to be related in a very strict way to leg length, all right? So eye height and leg length, right? That's what we're talking about here. So in a way, the scene that Shaq sees and the scene that I see give us each not only information about what's out there, but information about me and Shaq relative to what's out there, okay? So I'm getting information about the layout of surfaces that I'm detecting, but I'm also, because of that intersection of the horizon in this case, and this is just one example, I am getting information about my eye height, as is Shaq. And there's a law in animals and humans that kind of connect eye height to leg length. Okay, it's called an allometric law. It has to do with, I guess, allometric laws have to do with the way bodies grow over space and things like that, such that there is a relationship, kind of a lawful, trustworthy relationship between eye height and leg length for humans, right? There's some deviation in that a little bit, but for the most part, a higher eye height is going to be associated with a higher leg length, or a larger leg length than a lower eye height is going to be. So when I look at this scene as little Rosenblum, I am getting not just information for things that are out in the world, I'm getting information for my position in the world, which is giving me information about eye height. And because of the relationship between leg length and eye height, I am actually getting information in the visual array about my leg length. Not looking at it, but just as this is a perceptual system, this is a visual system that evolved to detect these regularities in the input. So I'm getting information about what's out there, my eye height relative to what's out there, which is related to my leg length, which is out there. And therefore, in a way, we can say that the information for eye height is giving me information for leg length. It's available in the input. So at least on this first pass, and this is a very kind of intuitive example, there's a lot more examples we'll discuss in just a second. But there is, in fact, according to kind of this kind of conceptualization of what the input information is, there is information for the things in the world and my relation to those things. Okay? And that's the job for Gibson, according to Gibson, that's the job of the perceptual psychologist, to look for that information, to look for the information for behaviorally relevant properties, affordances that's in the input, without having to say, well, the mind needs some sort of detailed body schema to determine how high you are and everything. Let's see if that information is available in the input before that happens. So this is how you explain that, how you might at least start to explain what the visual information is for step climbing, stair climbing, and that sort of thing, if you can show that that is in the input. Now, let's talk about some experiments that address this just a little bit. The idea about we might be measuring the world with an eye height metric. One thing I want to say about this is it is used as a way now for perceptual psychologists to measure things like distance. So you will see in papers, including things like time to contact and distance judgments and things like that. The perceptual psychologists will measure that space in terms of the perceiver's eye height. That's kind of become a tool in a way, since this was suggested back in the 80s. But there's some things about it that are interesting. First of all, maybe unsurprisingly, this kind of seems to hold for things that are within the kind of the immediate space of a perceiver, meaning that we're very good at making these judgments when things are within a behavioral space. And what I mean by behavioral space is things that we could interact with, by kind of very simple behaviors. When it comes to making distance judgments that are well beyond where we're interacting, so this is one of the issues for like a football team or a soccer team. They have to start making perceptually accurate judgments when things are very far away, and typically we have trouble with that. It has to, we're not quite as accurate, and that's why they have to learn to kind of offset the tendency. Because what happens with eye height is when we're judging distances, we actually kind of shrink our perceptual experience of this a little bit. So let me talk about the experiment. I guess that's probably the best way to do it. So in this experiment, it was known that in fact our sense of eye height does decrease. As you kind of move away quite far, so we're talking about 30 meters away, that sort of thing. The experimenters had people do a number of judgments. First, they wanted to have people do judgments based on what eye height might tell them, and that would be behaviorally relevant sorts of properties. But also, so that would involve things like actually judging eye height, but also whether things could be stepped on, whether things could be sat upon, all that sort of stuff. But then they also had people just judge the height of an object. Okay, so I can't remember exactly what they did. I think they put a small table that had legs that could be extended, and they were shown the table and say, is that something you could step on? Okay, great. Then the subject would be blindfolded. It would be then move back or forward, and they adjust the height again and say, okay, is that something that could be stepped on? And then they did the whole thing again, but now asking people if they could sit on it. Is this too high for you to sit on? Is this too low for you to sit on without kind of losing your balance? That sort of thing. Okay. Also, they asked people to judge their eye height. How many eye heights do you think this is away? Which is kind of an odd way of asking, but people can do that. Oh no, I don't think. I think for this experiment they asked people whether something was higher or lower than their eye height. I think that's what it was. That's an easier thing. But that last thing, the object. What they asked about the object properties were the dimensions in, I think, feet. Okay, how tall is the object you see there? Maybe they just used the same table and said, okay, is this, that looks like it's about 2 feet. They moved it out again. Oh, that looks like it's about 1 foot. They shifted it. So they are doing here, and the point of this is they are making here body relevant judgments for objects relative to their eye height, whether something could be stepped on, whether something could be sat upon. But then they had people making judgments about object dimensions that were not body relevant because they just asked for people to judge in meters or feet or some sort of extrinsic metric, some sort of extrinsic measuring system that wasn't body relevant. Okay. And what they found, is that with viewing distance, remember I said this before, that when you get really far out, people start underestimating how tall something is in terms of not just whether it's higher or lower than their eye height, but whether it's something that could be sat upon or stepped on. Okay, so what you're seeing here are what happens to people's judgments of, I guess, affordances with space, where this is showing people's judgments of the extrinsic measure. And the fact that it goes so differently is kind of interesting here. It suggests that when, like for behaviorally relevant sorts of perceptual properties, they are in fact seemingly going with their body dimensions, okay, which makes sense. However, for something that's extrinsically judged in terms of feet, in terms of meters, okay, that actually increases with distance for some reason. So an extrinsic judgment doesn't seem to be guided by things like a body relevant metric such as eye height. Okay, so object size does not follow the same thing. And if you just want to write this in, I probably should have put this. Should have put in parentheses extrinsic measured with extrinsic dimensions, meaning just things that aren't body relevant. Again, feet, meters, that sort of thing. That's what I mean by object size judgments. Okay. All right, that's the first thing. And then what they did is they brought them back into a lab, and they actually decided to manipulate eye height to see if that had an effect on affordance judgments. And in this case, they just had them wear 10 centimeter stilt blocks. They basically gave them giant platform shoes, I guess, that they could walk in easily. It wasn't like, the stilts that you have to learn to use a little bit with the poles. These were kind of like platform shoes that they could walk on fairly easily, and they walked around a little bit. But before they walked around too much, they asked people to do things like, again, judge the size of the block. That was one thing they had them do. Judge the eye height, things relative to the eye height, but then again, judge whether they could step on a platform or sit on that platform. So it was the same sort of thing as before. Okay. So they had, again, and by the way, the eye height judgments were in terms of whether something was higher or lower than your eye height. And these were whether you could step on it or sit on it. And they clearly manipulated, again, this platform height as they were asking these. And then, of course, they do the block height. And the block height, again, is going to be the extrinsic measure sort of trial. Okay. And the first thing is, it turns out they're really bad at judging the blocks. So they put the blocks actually, as people are wearing blocks, they put another pair of blocks outside or in front of them and ask them to make judgments about that block size in inches and centimeters or whatever metric they decide to use. People are not good at that. They're not good at judging the block height with those extrinsic measures. Okay. But what's interesting is what happens to their judgments of sitting and stepping, because the way this works is interesting. The way the step works is your eye height is now, the way the block works is your eye height is now higher as a function of wearing these stilts. But the stilts, the little blocks, the platform shoes, actually violate the law, the allometric law, because they add length, disproportionate length to your leg, right? So by using these little blocks, you are violating the allometric law with which your perceptual systems have evolved. And when that happens, you actually overestimate the step you believe you can walk on, okay? And underestimate the step or the platform you believe you could sit on, okay? And that happens at first. That's what this is showing at first. That at first you're not great at this at all, because these stilts, these platform shoes, are kind of undercutting the the law that typically links eye height to leg length. Okay, so stepping is at first overestimated. You think you can actually step on a platform at, like it's a stair that's higher than you actually can. And sitting is actually underestimated. You think that you can't sit on a platform that you actually can sit on because you're violating the relationship between eye height and leg length here. The legs are disproportionately longer, right? Okay, and all this is predicted from the artificial eye height that's been induced. However, this is a fortunate thing, you do learn to improve with experience. So I think what they did is they had people first make all these judgments after putting the blocks on, putting the platform shoes on for maybe a minute or two and kind of walk around a tiny bit. But then they actually have them do kind of, kind of walk arounds for, I think, maybe up to 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that, just walking around the lab a little bit. They weren't performing any tasks or anything, but they were allowed to walk, or maybe they walked down the hall outside the lab. Basically, they got used to it. And then they came in and made these judgments again, and they were much more accurate. In other words, they kind of learned over time to kind of pick out this new relationship between their leg length and their eye height, which is cool because affordances are going to change as we develop, right? As we grow, okay? What we can and can't do is going to change, right? We can't sleep in our little bassinets that we used to sleep in when we were tiny, but of course then we couldn't reach the counter where we, prepare our meals and stuff like that. So what the world affords us is going to change over our lifetime. And fortunately, it is something that can be learned. Affordances can be learned. Importantly, the affordances are there regardless of whether or not we are aware of them. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But affordances are things that can be learned. And for Gibson, I know you folks have been interested in perceptual learning. This is the goal for Gibson when it comes to perceptual learning. How do we detect affordances that we hadn't detected before? Okay. How do we extract information that has been there maybe, and I think Gibson would say it's always been there, depending on your height and all that stuff, that we hadn't detected before. And I think we all have intuitions about what this is like, right? I know whenever the example I always think of is when I rent a car. And I have a pretty tiny car myself. I have a Prius. But often when I'm traveling with the family, I rent a car that's bigger, right? Because we have our luggage and all that sort of stuff. And so it's usually wider and longer. And I know that I kind of, at that point, I am going through kind of a new affordance learning in that I have to now detect what I can and can't fit into in terms of a parking space, if I can fit between two cars, all that sort of stuff. What else? Well, when you're learning a new sport, you're learning a new instrument or something like that, you're learning to kind of pick out perceptual properties in the available information that's going to support behaviors that you haven't tried before. This is all perceptual learning. But it's not a question of kind of developing new representations for Gibson. It's a question of detecting these perceptual properties available in light that you haven't detected previously. Okay, so if you've gone through a perceptual development course, you might know that James Gibson's wife, Eleanor Gibson, is very famous for perceptual development research. She's the one that kind of did the original visual cliff research and looming research and stuff like that. She's very well known for this. The way she thought about this was, how does the system pick out properties of the information that it wasn't able to pick out before? It's not a kind of development of new representations. It's a development of the system attending to information that exists already. Okay. Okay. But let me take a break here and see if there's questions. Anyone have questions?
Yeah, I have a real simple about a question about the perceptual learning stuff. So, I mean, in some ways, I think like in a process of learning, actually we are changing ourselves, right? Like the person before learning and the person after learning is different.
Yeah.
So I think that is like a different angle to understand
Yeah,
perceptual learning.
I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think that that is more consistent with what Eleanor and James Gibson thought about it. That it is, in a sense, a new, it's not an old animal with new representations. In a sense, it's a new animal that is now able to
Yeah.
detect things that it's not detected before. I think that is pretty consistent with what they were arguing. Yeah.
And I have another quick question. So I'm wondering if like Gibson is using all these kind of things to reject indirect realism.
Mm-hmm.
Is that his intention to do these kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because I think he was dissatisfied with indirect realism in terms of its requirement of mental representation and, you know, the kind of philosophical baggage that comes with mental representation. And he also thought, I mean, he used to say, it sounds terrible, so I don't say this much, but he thought a lot of psychologists are lazy. You know, they don't really take into account the physics that's relevant to behavior and the physics that's relevant to perception. And in its place, in place of the, you know, a sufficient physical description, what they do is they kind of, you know, assume that the mind has to build up reality in a certain way. So, you know, he said, let's not give up on what the, you know, what the physical world is providing, you know, before we have to turn to mental representation, which has these issues. So he does want to limit representation down to a very, very small part of the equation. So yes, he wants to reject indirect realism.
Yeah, but you know, the thing is, I don't think they are I don't think the definition of meaning is the same for these two theories. Like for Gibson, like meaning is like the potential power to implement some behaviors, you know,
Right.
that kind of thing. But for the adherents of indirect realism, I think they are talking about meaning as a kind of language. Like they are like mental lease, right? It should be
absolutely,
like apple, like should be a word. But Gibson is ignoring all these language stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think they're just talking about different things.
Yeah, and I think what Gibson would say in that context is let's see how much meaning first can be understood as being a function of the animal and the environment and its relation before we bring in those things. I mean, what he was after certainly was a perceptual psychology and a you know, kind of a cognitive psychology that explained you know, animal behavior in general, successful animal behavior in general. And just because we can use a representational language doesn't mean that a representational language underlies all these very fundamental perceptual behaviors. Right? Do you understand that? So he is absolutely rejecting Fodor's notion of the language of thought. He said, you know, say, let's, you know, let's, just because we can use, I mean, it's kind of, you know, saying, well, kind of, there is this, you know, set of phenomena, language-related phenomena that humans show that we believe kind of give us an insight into how the mind works. But Gibson's saying, you know, it absolutely might not. It might kind of be just kind of a byproduct of these more fundamental sort of perceptual functions that all animals have. And let's understand this first and see if it can be explained without the kind of philosophical baggage that comes with something like a language of thought, that comes with representation. Yeah, so I understand what you're saying. They're kind of talking about two different things, and Gibson's saying, let's try to understand as much as possible with an approach that's parsimonious relative to the other sciences and relative to explaining general animal behavior before we bring this in. So Gibson would say, yes, we are talking about separate things, but I think Gibson would say, what I'm talking about is probably much more fundamental to behavior than what you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep, sure. Other questions? Okay, no problem. We'll go on and then we'll take a break. Just as a completely different example of this, I wanted to talk about praying mantids. This is just another sort of metric. So I talked about eye height as a metric. It's really cool. Other sort of metrics that have been discussed are interocular distance, right? So for animals, that have two eyes that are, a certain distance apart, that also scales to leg length. So the distance between my eyes is scaled to my leg length and my arm length. The distance between Shaq's eyes is scaled to his arm length and leg length. So interocular distance is another potential way that this could be relevant for information. And the example that's often discussed is praying mantids. There's a happy mantid. Looks like it just killed its mate. I don't know. I assume you folks know the cannibalistic mantid story, but that's not really relevant in this case. But I guess mantids, like crabs and lobsters and things like that, they go through growth spurts. Snakes do too. It's called ecdysis. I think that's pronounced right. We should look that up. Ecdysis maybe. Where they go through growth spurts. They kind of molt and they lose their exoskeletons. So, after they go through the growth spurt, they come out and they have a new interocular distance. And what you find for these things is the interocular distance, whenever they come out of one of these growth spurts, is proportional to their leg length. So there's ways to trick a praying mantid in the laboratory by putting little goggles on them. And this is cool. You put little goggles on them when they come out of their ecdysis that actually make their eyes seem further apart than they actually are. And then you kind of get a sense for their perception of spatial dimension by then placing, prey in front of them. So I don't know what they eat, maybe flies and mosquitoes or something like that. And you place it in front of them and you determine whether or not they're willing to strike at it. I guess they try to be as inconspicuous as possible, so they will only strike at things that are within their reach, okay, with their little front killer paws there, killer legs. And so you put a little, fly in front of them and see if they strike at it. Well, if in fact you've put those goggles on that are giving them a sense that their eyes are further apart than they actually are, they will strike at things that are beyond its leg length. They will, kind of in error strike at things that are further than its reach. And you take the goggles off and they're absolutely accurate. But the idea here is this might be another way that the visual information is in fact scaling the properties of the environment to the animal's own dimensions. So it doesn't have to be leg length. It doesn't have to be eye height, I should say. It can be interocular distance. And there's some great experiments like this with humans too. And the ones I'm aware of is where you can wear these special headphones that make your ears seem like they're further apart than they actually are. And you find that people will judge things differently in terms of what they can and can't reach with regard to sound sources, if in fact they are hearing the world from ears that are further apart than they are in real life. So you're now scaling the size of the head, the interoral distance, you're scaling the size of the head. So it is now kind of violating the allometric relationship between that dimension and the arm reaching dimension. So it kind of gives you a sense that, yeah, if you play around with these, kind of body scaled sorts of ways of gathering information, whether it's eye height or interocular distance or interoral distance, it affects the perception such that the behavior one, makes will depend on that. Okay, it will show that perceptual act and that, the behavioral act is going to depend on how the information is scaled to the receptors of the body, which is very cool. Just a couple of other things. I actually have been saying this. with regard to information for affordances. When we're talking about, so this is just a kind of way of tying it into other discussions that we've had with regard to information. Remember, we were discussing invariance, and there were structural and transformational invariance, and those were, kind of properties in the information that were the same across different instances. They were invariant, and we discussed things like shape constancy as being based on visual properties that worked along different geometries than the typical Euclidean geometry we assume that the visual information is being measured on. And we talked about transformational invariance with regard to point light actors and all that sort of stuff. So those are invariants. And so one way of thinking what an affordance is a kind of collection of invariants that are in themselves invariant. So, when we look at a chair, for example, what we are looking at is, dimensions of something that have a certain, height relative to the ground, a certain, depth, that sort of thing. And it's kind of, so when something is sit-onable, that's really the affordance we're talking about. We're not talking about chairs. We're talking about objects that can be sat upon. Sit-onable objects is a class of affordances. We're talking about the information for that thing having kind of an invariant collection of optical properties, including, the height of a surface, the extent of a surface, the support for the surface. That invariant collection of properties that are in themselves specified in the light is a set of invariants themselves. So when the term, you might see this in some of the readings, the term higher order invariance means it's basically an invariant collection of invariants, and that is one way of considering the information of affordances. Of course, all that has to be defined again relative to body dimensions. That's absolutely critical. That's absolutely critical. All this is body scaled information. And, as we've been saying, that this is where you see, animals behave in their most, kind of efficient and accurate way when you ask them to judge the world in terms of behavioral properties and not extrinsic metrics. And I should say, that in and of itself is has been a kind of a profound change, asking animals to make judgments. It's very far-reaching, and in fact, when I wrote my perceptual superpower book, it's one of the things I said was kind of, underlying the principles in the book. So I'm trying to give a very good example of this. By kind of reconsidering perception in its natural context, we started to realize that we have perceptual skills that we didn't think we had. And one of the great examples of that is human echolocation. And even though it's quite an old example, it's pre-Gibson, the idea here is by letting blind individuals, letting sighted individuals as well, explore their environment through sound rather than kind of measuring sound, in the laboratory that is very kind of abstracted and from, kind of machines or something like that, by kind of rethinking about how, listeners interact in their natural environments, you start to see these amazing things like, being able to use sound reflection, being able to very accurately judge sound source distance by having people, asking for reaches rather than for, extrinsic dimensions such as inches and meters. So that move in and of itself, I have to say, has revealed, I think, a lot of these kind of surprising perceptual abilities that people have. By just going for intrinsic rather than extrinsic measures. Intrinsic, always asking things that are action relevant, body scaled relevant. Extrinsic being kind of the more classic way of asking people to make judgments in terms of meters and feet and things like that. And you know, kind of just moving to the body like that, to moving a methodology to the body, moving methodologies to behavioral relevance, is a move that was made kind of by, in some ways, rejecting an indirect realism, at least parts of an indirect realism. And the part we're talking about here is the idea that there's this physical world that can be measured with physical sorts of tools, physical rulers and light meters and sound meters and things like that. And there's the reality. If there's perceptual deviations from that, then there are you know, kind of indirect things in the brain, in the mind, that are going to account for that. Let's kind of reject that notion and say, you know, the body and behavior in general, the animal measures the world in a way that is behaviorally relevant and is not animal neutral. We'll get back to that idea later, but it is in fact a move that's tied to this, you know, big picture of direct versus indirect realism. Okay. Yeah, let me go through this next slide, and then I think we'll take our break. Yeah, good place to do that. Okay, along those lines then, let's talk a little bit about the ontology of affordances. And what I mean here is you know, what's the kind of existence nature of affordances? Are affordances as things that are kind of, you know, perceived and you know, kind of thought that are to allow behaviors? Should we think of these things like the invitation characteristics that the Gestaltists talked about? Because at that point, you know, when we were talking about the Gestaltists, we talked about an affordance, kinda, right? We talked about a mailbox affording the behavior of mailing a letter, right? Maybe that's, you know, that is, you can still mail a letter this way, by the way, by using your own mailbox outside your house and putting its little flag up. The mailman will often come, not always. They don't always adhere to this anymore. I'm not sure if they were unaware of this, but in the old days, this is how we did mail letters. We put our little flag up and the mailman would say, oh, someone wants to mail a letter, and they take it out and put it in their bag before they took the mail that was for you and put it in the mailbox. But think about the other mailboxes that are still existent, at least in parts of our neighborhood, before recently so many were taken out. But anyway, so the phenomenal mailbox we talked about as having, you know, a kind of inviting a behavior when we had the desire to mail a letter. Okay, so in order for that mailbox to have that kind of invitation property, it was when we had a letter that we wanted to mail. Okay, when we did not have a letter that we wanted to mail, its invitation didn't exist. So the invitation, yeah, it was for the Gestaltists, it was a property potentially that was at least assigned to things in the world, but it was based on the desire, the intent of the animal. And because of that, you know, we talk about there being a geographical environment that is not only measured by different tools than how we typically measure our, you know, actions, our behavior, but is animal neutral. And that's a very important notion, that there's nothing about a behavior in that mailbox does not invite behavior in the geographical environment. Okay, it invites behavior in the behavioral environment as it depends on my intent. The geographical environment, though, is something that is, you know, separate from the animal's wants, separate from the animal's intent, where it's the behavioral object. The mailbox is a behavioral object that we bring that in and say that's where we have the intentional object. That's the object that we're going to behave towards because we have, in this case, the intention to mail a letter. Okay, so, but there still is, you know, this kind of sense that, well, you know, there's a mailbox kind of inviting a behavior. Maybe that's how we should think about affordances. And Gibson was very clear on this. For Gibson, he wanted affordances to exist, or he thought of affordances as existing regardless of behavior. I'm sorry, oh shoot, that was terrible. Regardless of intent, okay? For Gibson, a mailbox always affords mailing a letter even if you have no interest in mailing a letter. Okay. Stairs always afford climbing for a animal with certain legs, even if you don't want to. A chair always affords sitting, even if you don't want to. It has nothing to do with the intent. It is just defined, an affordance is just defined by the physical properties of the object and the physical properties of the animal. Okay. So, the chair that affords sitting for me, but not Elsie, my elephant pet, okay, is always going to have that property. It's always going to have that affordance property. And it's always going to have information. That affordance property is always going to be have information for it in the light. Okay, so it is not different. So for affordances, the physical object is the same as the behavioral object. It's not as if it's dependent on the intent of the perceiver by any means. Okay, the affordance property is detected. It is the object of perception, but it is not dependent on any desire by the animal. Okay, that's something that's not important. It is absolutely dependent on the environment and the animal, but importantly and critically for Gibson, what it depends on is the animal's dimensions. And I can get a little bit fancier. That the animal's kind of I guess behavioral potential in terms of what it can do with its limbs and things like that. Nothing to do with the kind of psychological state of the animal as is classically known. It is completely independent of awareness. My kids didn't know what a mailbox did for the first probably 10 years of their lives. However, they were probably tall enough to use a mailbox long before that. So that mailbox, as soon as they were tall enough to use it, always for them afforded mailing, or when they were tall enough, afforded mailing, even though they didn't know that's what a mailbox did. They then learned to detect that affordance property as it was indicated or was specified in the light, but that affordance was always there for them. And based on that, it kind of pushes a different way of measuring the environment from the scientist's perspective, right? From the scientist's perspective. The scientists, according to Gibson, the perceptual psychologist, should be thinking about measuring aspects of the world in terms of how the animal is going to detect it. So that's why scientists have started to measure, describe distances in eye height in scientific papers and things like that. But it is not in a kind of quote objective geographical physical description. It is going to be one, for Gibson, most effectively understood in terms of behavioral potential. And so Gibson's going to say, all right, we can redo a physics here. We can do a physics here that, it's not a deviation from classical physics or anything like that, but we can describe the physical world objectively without any sort of mental component, any sort of psychological component, objectively relative to animals and the potentials for their behavior. Not dependent on intent, desire, any of those things, just dependent on the anatomy and the behavioral potential of the animal and the properties that allow the behavioral potential to be acted on. Okay. And yeah, you can do a physics there. And that physics might be the one that's going to be most important for perceptual psychologists to do to understand the world as it's relevant to an animal. Okay. So there is an absolute rejection of that barrier to realism. Physics is not complete, right? And more than that, there's not this incommensurability of the behavioral world and the physical or geographical world, the physical world, the physicalese and the mentalese. No, that's not important for Gibson at all. That's kind of a false dichotomy. Okay, the physical world, as perceptual psychologists should measure it, is in fact the behavioral world. Okay, all right, this is a good place to stop. But let me see if there's any questions, and we'll take our little break.
So it just seems like indirect realism for Gibson is something else. It's something different.
Say that again.
Like, yeah.
What's something different?
Yeah, it seems like, oh, sorry. Yeah, it seems like the definition of like the assumptions of indirect realism for Gibson is something a little bit different because it's
Yeah,
nothing about mentalese.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're saying. I mean, I hopefully before when I introduced the concepts behind indirect realism, I did it in a way that's consistent with how I'm describing them now as I talk about how Gibson's rejecting them. If I didn't, I might have misspoke.
Like maybe I got it wrong, but in my view, the incommensurability of natural kinds is talking about like we cannot use meaning-related language to describe physical world, and also we cannot use physical language to describe the mental world. Like so there's incommensurability of this language system, but here we're not talking about any language related stuff.
No, right. No, I mean, on some level we are, but it's not certainly the most important part of the distinction that I think Gibson wanted to make. It really has less to do with language in a way and more to do with what the most accurate and I guess truthful description is of these two spaces, these two hypothetical spaces. One is physical, one you describe with physics, and the other one you describe with kind of meaning and mental mental dimensions and that sort of thing. And there's just no way you could redo your description of the geographical environment to make it behaviorally, perceptually relevant. And Gibbs is saying, no, that's not true. We can describe the environment. We can with still very grounded physical sorts of descriptions, but physical descriptions that are now going to be the dimensions that are perceptually and behaviorally relevant. So it has less to do with language in that sense, I think. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Okay, oh, did you have something, Michael?
Mm.
I have a.
Oh.
No, you know what? I'm gonna think about it and ask later.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll chat a little bit before I continue the lecture when I get back. Okay. See you in a few minutes. Hey, everybody. Sorry I was a little late there. I don't know if you folks are helping out with the grad recruitment thing. I don't know if you're following it. They'll probably have you do certain things, but it's going to be so different this year. Obviously, you know, we're like you folks came out last year. We're not going to be able to have folks come out this year, and so the whole thing's online. What we've been asked to do is to do virtual lab tours, but I've been going on campus. I think I told you about once every 2 weeks, so it's not awful for us. But other people have to somehow figure out a way of filming their lab. It's a complete coincidence. One of my RAs did a little video lab tour last spring with music and stuff like that. And it's about a minute long, so that's pretty much the right length. But it kind of looks like, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it's very, you know, it's kind of almost like a music video or something like that, by the way that he, you know, kind of used the camera and the music and kind of orchestrated the whole thing. So I've been working on having to put a narration on top of it, and and then I have to add my image somehow to it. And I'm just not, you know, we do a lot of video stuff in my lab, but when it comes to artistic video stuff, I have no idea what I'm doing. And all of us have to do this, I guess. So you're going to see some very funny and nerdy professors doing lab tours, you know, with as much, you know, kind of high production as they can muster. So it could end up being very, very funny. That's why I was a little late. I was working on that. But anyway, okay, let me take a second here to see if you folks have any questions before we continue with our discussion.
I was kind of curious, to what extent would you say that affordances are a like innate natural phenomenon versus something that is learned? Because even animals will learn, like, I can sit on that, I can climb on that kind of thing. Yep. And if you're like a baby, you don't know, you know, I'm thinking of like a puppy or a wolf puppy or something like that, trying to climb on a rock and falling off.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important question in that I guess the best answer is affordances themselves are physical properties. They are physical properties. Detection of affordances is something that can be learned. Okay. And not only are affordances physical properties, but the visual information for the affordances are also physical properties. But just because it's there doesn't mean that you're detecting it. And for Eleanor Gibson and folks that have followed her, including John Franchak, I don't know if you're familiar with John's work. He's a terrific researcher. He his own, well, he knew Eleanor Gibson. I don't think he worked directly with her, but his own advisor did work with Eleanor Gibson. He's exactly interested in this, how does an infant, a child, learn to, you know, detect the affordances of things like, you know, navigating like doorways, navigating, I don't know what else his typical methods are. I think it's like apertures, doorways, maybe some sort of stairs, I'm not sure. But you know, how to think about the visual information for these behaviors, how then the child learns to detect them, and the kind of principles of kind of perceptual learning. So from that perspective, the perceptual learning is to learn to detect the information that is already there. And that's the best way to say it. Affordances themselves are physical properties. The information for affordances are clearly physical properties, but being able to detect it is what changes the animal, essentially. And I think Mac's intuition here is right, that you can think of it as being a new animal in a way, you know? Yeah. The other way I like to think about that, the new animal thing, is to think about a spring. You know, I think you find that folks that are interested in this approach do think a lot about physical metaphors for psychological properties. And if you think about a spring with a mass hanging out, I should have had something like this. You know, I'm using all these props from my classes, my other class. I probably have a spring and a mass somewhere in this garage. I could have made one. But, you know, imagine there's a spring here and a little weight at the end of it. And, you know, I let go and it kind of settles on its, you know, kind of equilibrium, its property where it bounces and ends up. But over time, what happens is that spring is actually going to change its elastic properties because it keeps on getting, you know, pulled. You know how springs work over time. After a while, they, you know, if you had a slinky here, after a while, it's the slinky spaces between the little loops would increase, and so what's going to happen is the weight is going to settle at a different position. And it actually is a branch of physics called hereditary mechanics that kind of studies this. So the spring stiffness constant every time the spring is acted on actually changes. And so it is, in some ways, you can think of this as a new spring by virtue of its experience, right? And that's kind of a way maybe to think about learning in some ways, that, you know, every time we learn something, we become, in a way, a new animal by virtue of experience, which sounds kind of, you know, paradoxical in a way, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And, you know, there are other ways of thinking about this, even if it, you know, it seems a little counterintuitive and seems like it might be kind of harder to kind of implement in a model or a theory or something like that. It is something just to consider.
You have a perfect example of that behind the Ferris wheel there. It's a garage door.
What, say that again?
I said you have a perfect example of the spring analogy behind the Ferris wheel. It's a garage door.
Oh, the garage door. Yeah. Where are my springs? Oh, the springs are up here, by the way. Here.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it's a wound spring,
Right.
but it's the same idea. You have to get it tuned after a while. Yeah.
Tell anybody.
Sorry.
Don't you feel like you're seeing the wizard?
I had a quick question. Where do you think that tools lie in all of this? Because in a lot of ways, it's like not
Absolutely.
as natural.
Yeah, absolutely.
Weird.
Learning new affordance properties, you know, learning the affordance of the tool itself. And then, you know, as you know, we learn more about the brain, we know that kind of in a way, the tool becomes a part of the body in a way. And then you learn the affordances that are available to the tool itself. Yeah, so it's a great example.
It's almost like reverse engineered.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of thinking of it. Yeah, Gibson talked a lot about tools and tool use and what happened with, you know, the perceptual skills of a carpenter or something like that. You know, how that changed. Okay, other questions?
It seems like affordance is a concept that is really similar to secondary quality. Yeah, to secondary quality. Yeah, the thing that invented by Locke, John Locke. Yeah, yeah, because
but those were things that were considered to be a function of the mind, right? Secondary qualities.
I think secondary quality is like the potential power in that object that can like produce the perception of color in our mind, right? So, you know, so in that way, it's really similar.
Right. I mean, yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. In kind of behavioral potential or potential for a perceptual experience or something like that. The affordance seem like that. Yeah. I mean, but you know, secondary qualities are often. Yeah. No, I guess I see what you're saying, that it has the potential to create a perceptual experience along this. Yeah. I guess you could say with a more behavioral sort of emphasis, you could think of secondary qualities. Yeah, right. Because I don't think color is really a
it's not a behavioral
property or something like that. But I understand what you're saying. Right. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Let's continue then. And so we did finish this, right? Yes. So I'm gonna do a little summary here, just to before we kind of get into issues of mechanism and things like that. I just want to do a little summary. This is a little review, not coming in a bad time, of course, where we talked about these different approaches as being mostly distinguished between what happened at the mental embellishment, the mental enhancement sort of stage of perception, whether it was unconscious inference and kind of extracting sensation and bringing memory. The Gestalt approach with its innate laws of organization, again, starting with the sensation and then organizing the sensations according to, the field properties of the brain, innate, of course, being a kind of, placeholder for that. Or the connection patterns, like, we can talk about the sensations, again, starting off and then being kind of structured in a different way. And in some important ways, the connections are kind of, connection patterns are maybe a little bit more, consistent with emergent property theories and things like that. But what was clear here is that all these theories started with sensation that was impoverished, that needed some sort of mental process that gave rise to perception. So everything except the nature of the mental process was the same for these theories. And that's not true of Gibson. That was the only theory we really discussed where this flow chart is going to seem very different. And let's just work up to how that's going to look. So these are now the premises of the ecological approach, and you can think of this just as a little bit of a review. Of course, the emphasis is understanding the animal in its natural environment in such a way that the animal is described relative to the environment, and the environment is described relative to the animal. So we're not talking about the animal and the environment, as we're really talking about the animal and its environment. The notion of niche here is absolutely critical. The environmental properties that we're going to be describing, including the informational properties in light and sound, are measured, are described in reference to an animal, to the point where we're actually talking about things like eye height and interocular or interoral distance and things like that. Okay, those aspects of the environment, the light is described very, very closely in relationship to the animal. And we made some very simple moves by putting things on the ground and always seeing things relative to other things. The relational aspects of the stimulus was very important. Allowing the animal to move, again, all very kind of intuitive aspects of how Gibson was making perceptual psychology more ecological, more kind of natural, more representatively designed in terms of the methodology. The Brink example, again, talking about the nature of the information being things that were very abstract. And of course, probably the most critical thing as we were discussing it in terms of the raw information was the relationship between the environment and the information itself. So it is a complete rejection of the barrier we discussed of the intractable non-specificity. Gibson's saying, let's find how the informational input, let's find how the light, how the sound is in fact lawfully related to the objects in the world, as well as the perceptual experience of those objects. So it's also in a way a rejection of the barrier called the the separation between sensation and perception. The independence of perception and sensation. So here we're going to understand sensation a little bit differently as really stimulation, right? So maybe that's really what it is, the independence of stimulation and perception. Gibson's saying, no, the stimulation as it's being, sampled across the senses is in fact going to tell you what the perceptual property is. It's just a question of showing that stimulation is lawfully related to the things in the world. So it's kind of a rejection of both of those barriers completely. And by the way, you should see here and I've been discussing this earlier as well, it'd be good to know for you how Gibson does, I guess, step by step reject these barriers to realism. You know, he's going for perceptual realism. And so how does he reject these things? What aspects of the theory play a role in the rejection of these different barriers to realism? That's a good test question, if I can say so myself. What else? So the information is not ambiguous, and perception is based on the proximal stimulation alone. And you know, it's really a question of attending to the proximal stimulation that's going to support different sorts of, you know, perceptual properties that are going to support behavior. So what's not needed here is inferences or, you know, construction from like a structuralist perspective or a computationalist perspective. I mean, you know, for all intents and purposes from this, you know, as we're talking about enhancement, construction and you know, kind of mental processes, all these things are you know, can be lumped together. Of course, as we, you know, the first part of the course was talking about what the important differences between all those theories were, but from the perspective of Gibson, it's all the same stuff, really. He wants to do a psychology without these enhancements, without these embellishments, whether they are construed as organizations or connections or whatever. He wants to do a psychology without the need for mental representation. Now that seems, again, very, very radical, but hopefully you're getting a sense of where he's going with this. And, you know, mental representation is proven too useful for everyone just to, you know, come up with new theories that are going to reject mental representation, probably. Although there are certainly Gibsonian theories of social psychology and personality psychology and things like that. You know, it's a useful tool, but Gibson's saying it is a placeholder, that ultimately what's going to be found are lawful properties of, you know, the environment taken in relation to the animal, as well as the information taken in relationship to the animal. So we should be thinking of ways that can be done, and ultimately we can possibly do a true cognitive psychology and full psychology without representation, starting with what he considered the most fundamental, which was perception. And this is the direct approach that, yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So when we're thinking in terms of like, even at a like a raw biological level, at some point there is like a representation of something we've seen. If we could, you know, if we just, you know, measure like neural activity and, you know, like the eye is looking at, you know, this keyboard, and we can verifiably show that the brain is processing the image of the keyboard and understanding it.
Right.
So that's still a representation, right?
Yes, depending on how you define representation, right? So yes, of course, we're going to find, you know, neurophysiological activity that's going to correspond to, you know, perceptual properties and properties of the world and all that sort of thing. But the way representation has been used by most of these theories is of something that was in itself insufficient for perception to occur. So the representations that we discussed were representations that needed to be computed upon, or whether those computations involve, you know, organizational principles or connection strengths or stuff like that, there needed to be some enhancement of representation. And there also needed to be, you know, the representations needed to be interpreted, whether they were interpreted through the process or something like that. So it's one thing to say, you know, there's a correspondence between something that goes on in the nervous system and, you know, a behavior or perceptual experience and something that goes on in the world. It's another thing to say that representation is kind of a piece of the computations that are involved. So the way we had been discussing representation through most of our discussion in this quarter was a representation as one of the components that needed to be acted on by the mental process in order to arrive at a perceptual experience or behavior or something like that. Gibson certainly wants to do away with that notion of representation. And he wants to figure out what the brain is in fact doing if it's not enhancing a representation, if it's not embellishing what the sensation is and how that's represented. So he at that point, is it a representation? If finding a correspondence between the nervous system and either a perceptual property or a real world property, I'm not sure it's the type of representation that really carries any weight. I'm not sure if that's a representation that you can call that a representation. It's fine. It's the semantics then, but it's not the way we've been discussing representation as a building block of the entire perceptual process, which Gibson definitely wants to do away with. See what I'm saying? Mike, hello?
Yeah, no, sorry, I'm just kind of thinking about it.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, though. In theory, I'm still thinking of, like, again, going back to, I don't know, let's take the chair example. When I see a chair, I have all the access, the affordances of the chair, and I'm kind of imagining them as little, like, flags popping off if it says, you can sit on this, you can pick this up, you can push this. That's still sort of, like, to me, that's sort of the representational thing, though. That's our, like, we see things, that's our understanding of the object that is independent of the actual object. Like, we can imagine that changing, right?
Right. Well, that's absolutely, a classic computationalist perspective on this. And what Gibson would say is all those things are absolutely part of the object when described in a behaviorally relevant way. Yeah. By the way, I can't see you right now, so I don't know that you're just thinking and stuff like that. But do you understand that idea that yeah, those are our intuitions. That's what we've learned in all of our psychology classes, that those properties are not, that's just a stupid chair. There's nothing behaviorally relevant about that at all. And Gibson's saying, yeah, well, we can do a different physical description where we can show that all these things are there, and as is the information. What makes that any less real is the question. We say, well, we've always assumed these are mental properties. Say, well, this is actually these are I can measure right now with my little rulers the relationship between my limbs and my leg length and the chair that's over here and its height and all that sort of stuff. These are fundamental physical measurements, but taken in reference to an animal. And so it is absolutely switching your ontology here and saying that, these are properties that are just as real and just as physical. It's just we typically don't consider them when it comes to how we define the external world and the psychological world as being so different. So it is really turning the whole story on its head. And I can't see you. I'm not sure how you're reacting, but does that make some sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah, I understand how unintuitive this is. I completely understand, and I don't, I always say this. I don't really care in some ways whether you accept it, you think it's nuts, or any of the other theories for that matter. I really like kind of broadening ideas. I really like, kind of going back to first principles and saying, is this physics? Is this all the physics a perceptual psychologist needs? Is this all the physics a cognitive psychologist needs? Or is there something else we can do about this? These are ingrained things. These are counterintuitive. It doesn't kind of mesh with our kind of introspections about psychology, but it still is physical. I mean, it's still possible. And if it's a physical description, that's kind of cool. Because wouldn't it be nice? I mean, remember we started off discussing the ghost in the machine, the idea that psychology is a second-rate science, partly because we kind of have this, kind of mental component that, we're not sure how to exactly coordinate with it when it comes to cause and the nervous system and all that sort of stuff. And Gibson's almost saying, let's see how much we can do without the quote mental parts before we bring these things in. That's he really kind of wants to make it more consistent with the other scientists, the other sciences that don't have this kind of extra mental component to them. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, I'll assume yes. I can't see you still. That's all right. Do you have other questions or?
No, sorry. I'm
Okay,
saying
that's
yes.
fine. You know, it's just when I put the when I put up the image from, you know, to be recorded, it's just me and the slides, and I can't see you while I'm doing that. Then when I know we're going to be talking, I usually try to reveal it all. So I'm sorry that I wasn't able to see your reaction. Anyway, so this is the direct approach. I mean, this is the idea, is that, you know, it's a perceptual psychology and potentially a cognitive and general psychology, where there is nothing in between the animal's awareness of the world and the world. There's nothing, no sort of mental representation between these things. And so this, in a way, is the flow chart for the ecological approach, where, look at this, look at all the things that are missing. Yes, the first thing you notice is all that enhancement that we discussed above, the inferences, the construction, the organization, representations are not there. But look what else is missing. It's the sensations. And what Gibson's saying is that's not the beginning of perception. What is the beginning of perception is, first of all, an environment that's described in animal relevant terms, and an informational support that's described in animal relevant terms. And it you know, it is somehow getting to the receptor surfaces. You know, he's not denying that there are receptors and all that, but the receptors are doing things that are very different. And the goal then is not to discover the kind of intermediaries between, you know, insufficient sensation and perception. It's to understand what the information is, what the rich information and specificational information is between the environment and the receptor surface. You know, discover those properties such that we don't need to bring in those other things. And that's really what makes this approach direct. And this is what makes it a direct realism. Okay. Okay, so let's continue talking a little bit about this and try to understand what we're thinking the nervous system's job is going to be. Because clearly, you know, we got a brain. What's the brain for? You know, keeps our eyes warm. You know, what are we going to do with the brain if, in fact, it's not going to be constructing our psychological experience? Okay, what's it going to be doing? And this is, you know, there's actually some more recent writing on this. I should kind of get up on that a little bit, but I'm going to give you some of Gibson's original writing, and then we're going to move towards some more modern stuff towards the end. But I probably should update this a little bit, but I wanted to talk about how Gibson thought about this. Of course, the emphasis is on the information that we know. The emphasis is on the input, and trying to understand then what the neurophysiology should do. So what is the job description of the neurophysiology? What is, I mean, if the input's all there, what does the brain do? And what Gibson would say is, well, it's there to detect. It's a detection device, not a construction device. It's going to detect higher order information. And for him, he thought a much more apt metaphor for the brain, rather than as a computer. And this was a time where the computational approach was, you know, going full force. So you know, let's not think about that. If the information is rich, if you know, we're able to show that there are these regularities that are available to the senses, then you don't need much of a computer. Really, what you need is something much more like a resonance system, a resonance model. And you know, I assume you know a little bit about what resonance is. I have a guitar here I could show you, but yeah, okay. Well, so you know, like when you're pushing a kid on a swing. Oh, by the way, okay. I'm sorry about this. We did talk about this. We talked about resonance in the context of Hebb a little bit, where, you know, we were talking about kind of, you know, groups of neurons kind of resonating depending on the stimulus, and then how the connections of those things can change and how that resonance can change. And we also talked a little bit about those electrochemical fields when we were discussing the Gestalt approach. But now it's kind of, maybe it makes a little bit sense to kind of get into the, I guess, kind of mechanics of it just a tiny bit more. What we're talking about with resonance is, you know, some sort of system that's kind of more excited, shows greater activity when a certain stimulus is provided. And for a swing, for example, you know, if you're pushing a kid on a swing in order to make her go higher, you push at a very specific point in the trajectory of the swing, right? It's not, you know, you want to get it when she's going back. And what you're doing is you're timing your force to the movement of the swing, okay? If you don't, say sometimes you push, you know, too early, or sometimes you push too late, you're not going to make her go higher. So what you're doing is you're basically increasing the amplitude of the swing by kind of allowing yourself to force the swinging motion at its resonant frequency, at the frequency it's currently going at. Okay, so that's the idea of resonance. Here's another example. This is actually called a resonator guitar. And it wasn't designed to demonstrate resonance. Actually, the resonator is in this part, but it's tuned up nicely. That's not too nicely, but it kind of will easily show this. What I can do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just play one string, and then I'm going to stop it. But because these other strings are in fact tuned in a way that is resonant with that first string, and they're all connected to the same little piece right here, called the nut, you're going to see that the other strings are going to resonate because of this original kind of driving force. So here it is. And now I'm going to, oops, let me do it again. And now I'm going to stop that string, but you're still going to hear other strings resonating. Can you hear it? I stopped the string. Can you hear that? Let me do it again. I can also do it here. And now let me do it down here. Now I'm going to stop that string. But you hear how it still goes? It's because this string is kind of driving these other strings because they're tuned, you know, fairly well to the pitch of this string, to the frequency of this string. If they're not tuned to that, it won't work. So that is an instance of resonance as well. And so all we're really talking about is, you know, one thing kind of inducing a kind of force onto something else that's designed in a way to react to it. Okay, that's designed to react to it. And you can show this in other ways besides the guitar. You can show it with two tuning forks if they're tuned to the same pitch. You hit one and then you dampen it, you grab it. The other one's tuned to the same pitch, it will resonate. When you see cuckoo clocks on a wall in a clock shop, and they're all kind of swinging at the same time, that has to do with resonance. And we know physicists know a lot about resonance models. It's, you know, something they can do a lot of prediction of, and they can get these things kind of harnessed really accurately. That is how Gibson kind of wants to think about the nervous system. So when Mike said, you know, there's clearly a representation, you know, in the brain when we look at something, when we look at a chair, we see the nervous system reacting to it. Gibson would say, that's fine. It could be resonance. I mean, it absolutely could be resonance. That's very different, however, from saying that there's going to be something that then is enhancing that. So Gibson kind of wants to think about the nervous system as kind of comprised of functionally defined resonators that are resonating to this higher order information. And by the way, it's not going to be a chair that it's resonating to, really. It's going to be, he's more interested in the resonance to the, you know, the affordance property of sit-on-ability or something like that. He wants to, you know, he thinks that's where you're going to find the real, you know, kind of important stuff in the brain. So it's a very different metaphor, what we're talking about here. It's not a construction metaphor. It's not a computer metaphor. It is much more of a resonance metaphor. And by the way, resonance works with electrical systems too. When we use our radios in our cars, do we still do that? You know, when you're looking for different frequencies, you're basically changing the electrical configuration of the radio to resonate to different, frequency modulated signals that are going through space, going through the air. And that's exactly how a radio works. It's, I guess, maybe kind of how a TV still works. I'm not sure anymore, but I used to be able to use these examples. I'm not sure if I can use them anymore. But that's the idea. So it's a very different sort of metaphor. And it's radical. Don't get me wrong. I understand how radical this is. You say, well, what about the Hubel and Wiesel stuff? Right? There's evidence for single cells that seem to respond to features, and Gibson's going to say that sort of stuff is kind of a byproduct of what the brain's really doing, which is resonating to the higher order information, the complex specificational information that is available. Okay. Boy, I want to make sure we can get through the rest of this. I think I'm going to skip this next part. Yeah. Perceptual systems versus senses. I'm going to skip this, all the details. I just wanted you to know that when he's describing the receptors, as I said, receptors are still going to be part of the process for Gibson. They have to detect this information. He's going to describe the receptors as being part of what he calls perceptual systems that are not passive, but are always acting, always moving, always seeking out information. So the complexity of the input is going to partially be a function of, did I do that? Sensory systems that are, in fact, not just kind of passive sensors of light and sound, but active kind of gatherers of information. I'll just put these things up here that they explored. The eyes adjust, they optimize. The visual system includes two eyes as well as a head and a body that can move. It involves the input nerves and the output nerves, and it actively obtains stimulation, and its inputs are going to be specific to things in the world, and it also, this is the thing that at that level the system resonates as well, and potentially it's something that can learn. So I don't care that you know those details. I do care that you know that the receptors that are part of that flow chart I showed before are considered to be of a very different nature in a way. I mean, we're still talking about, retinal cells ultimately, being involved in the transmission and the, transduction. But you consider for Gibson the entire system, including the system that can move on the head and the body. Oh, here comes my gardener. Okay, don't know if you can hear that. What I would like to talk though about is continuing with these metaphors for devices. I think this is actually really interesting. So talking, what is a nice metaphor? So talking about a resonance system as a metaphor for the neurophysiology of a direct approach. How can we talk about that? And this is a paper by one of Gibson's students, Sverker Runesson, Swedish. And he liked to think of it this way, that you can I guess engineers sometimes think of any device as being classified into one of two categories. A rote device would be a device that is comprised of very simple components that deal specifically with simple input, where if it's going to be able to do complex sort of things, that complexity comes from the connections, the organization of those components. The complex processing is going to come from the connection. And yes, that's going to be relevant to connectionism. So I know that word there is probably flagging that for you, but it's also relevant to just general computer. That the organization of the components, the connections between the components, is going to be the thing that derives the complex processing. And think about a computer. It is flexible. Our computers can do so many different things, but its solutions for all those things are, kind of constrained by the kind of components that are making up the system. Unfortunately, what that does is sometimes it causes things to be somewhat unreliable. And that's why you get crashes and things like that. And again, the metaphor here is a digital computer. So a digital computer for engineers, as Runeson argues, is kind of the prime example of a rote device. And he doesn't think that that's really the metaphor that one needs if you're trying to understand the mechanism for Gibson, because we're not dealing with simple input for Gibson at all. We're dealing with highly complex input such that we can talk about a different type of device. And he calls these things smart devices. I think this is an engineering term, where the components are actually specialized for a given type of input. And the input is complex and very specific to the context, very specific to what the input is, to what the function is at that time. It is not flexible. It doesn't really do things well, but it is more reliable because it is a device that's specially designed to make use of complex input that's of a very specific type. And his metaphor for this, his example of this, I should say, is a device called the polar planimeter, which, as it turns out, is still something that's still in use. This is an old-fashioned one. Looks kind of steampunky, this one, doesn't it? I think from the 19th century. And it's a device that's used to measure irregular forms, kind of odd shapes on a drafting blueprint. Okay, so the way it works, just very quickly, is it's imagine you have a blueprint of, I don't know, some sort of park. Okay, we'll use a park. And you want to, there's a pond in the middle of the park, and it's got, kind of a weird, lima bean shape, the pond. And you want to see how much area that pond is taking up. Well, this device does exactly that, and kind of only that. Any sort of irregular shape, it can do very well. And the way it works, just so you have a general idea, is here, I can show you. You basically, this is a weight, and you basically put that down somewhere, away from the thing you're measuring. And this is also a little weight, but this is kind of suspended up by this rod here. And in this part right here, you've got a kind of a series of wheels and gears and things like that. This looks like maybe there's one wheel that contacts the surface of the blueprint, but there's also gears and things like that. But this is the pointer, and this is the thing that you use to trace the circumference or the outside of that pond. So you would just move this, you have a little pond shape on your blueprint, and you kind of move it around. And then here, a number comes out that tells you the area of that shape on the blueprint. And guess what? That's all it does. You cannot use this, okay, to measure, say, a line. It doesn't work well. You can't measure, like, the height and width of a building that's there. It really only works with, kind of, more complicated shapes. And the way it does work, by the way, is this thing kind of rolls and skids and kind of picks up on the complex motion that you're using here to trace the thing. And, based on all these little pieces, kind of how they connect together and how it kind of, quote, interprets, or how it reacts to the skids and the rolling, the number comes out. And so it is not good at kind of taking the smallest components of the image, the degree you could do this, the horizontal and the vertical dimensions at each position of the pond. It only does this. These are specialized components to deal with the complex input that's going to be specific to context. It can't be used for anything else, including measuring straight lines on the blueprint. It just doesn't do a good job with that. It's got to go in multiple directions to do any job at all. But it is highly reliable. They still use these things. I'm sure they're much more complicated now. And they probably have some sort of Bluetooth transmission that goes over to the computer or something like that. and it is very, very reliable. Yeah, I think this is great. He kind of says, this is the sort of device we should think of as the brain kind of making itself up. So it's, you know, clearly the metaphor of the brain as computer is intuitive for us. Here we have these cells that are like microchips and on and off states and all that sort of stuff. But he's saying that, you know, it doesn't need to be thought of like that. Instead, the brain can be considered as kind of fashioning, you know, temporary, kind of specialized smart devices every time it encounters new information. So it is a device that, you know, it's kind of broadening our resonance metaphor that, yeah, there, you know, the brain is kind of making up functionally, you know, established resonators, and the way the resonators might, you know, kind of work in more detail is through kind of a smart device sort of thing. It's specialized for the situation. It's dealing with complex input, no question. It isn't flexible at that point when it's a functionally defined resonator. It's not flexible, okay? But it's very reliable, okay? And so I think it's kind of a nice way of rethinking what the metaphor is, kind of moving away from a computer metaphor, which even in a, you know, connectionist sort of model is, you know, considered processing. So he's trying to kind of move away from a processing model in general. Okay, what do I have here? You know, I won't go through this in some detail. I want to get to some other stuff. So, but he then, and other people have talked about this, support for perceptual mechanisms as a smart device. Clearly, we are, you know, I've already mentioned these things. We're dealing with complex tasks all the time, you know, such as returning a tennis serve. And, you know, you ask the tennis player to evaluate the velocity of the ball or the horizontal and vertical position of the ball. They're not good. Their, you know, their task skill is good for that task, but it's, you know, it doesn't kind of generalize to what we would consider to be classically the physical components of that task. You know, that's not how things work. It is really set up for doing complex tasks, that complex task of returning the tennis serve. Potentially, if Gibson's right, higher order information is what's running the show. So if that is the type of input, yeah, it's a smart device that's going to be the better metaphor here. It is stable information. That's something else I should have mentioned earlier, that there's a kind of assumption here that that it's going to be the same type of information from case to case to case, whether it is a pond that's being outlined, or importantly, the time to arrival information that we discussed, or the global flow information we discussed. These are invariant kind of informational dimensions that make the input stable for Gibson. And people have kind of redone some of the neurophysiology, kind of looking at these sort of things. So where would we expect to see, you know, these sort of smart devices in the visual system? And I'll talk a little bit about this more, but, you know, we can, I can provide some other references. People have kind of approached these sort of things looking for, you know, kind of time to arrival detectors and global flow detectors in the nervous system and that sort of thing. And clearly, I mean, we're going to talk about these things functionally defined. It's not like there's just a set group of cells that are going to be, you know, resonating to global flow. We're talking about it as being functionally defined. So, you know, that group of cells could be defined in other ways too. You're going to see that it actually kind of ties into some of the kind of cell synchrony sort of stuff that's been conceived of recently in the neurophysiology field as well. Okay, but I also want to think of this, which I think you'll find really interesting.
Hang on a sec.
I'm going to have to speed up just a tiny bit, of conceiving of the nervous system as a kind of medium for law. So again, not thinking of the nervous system as constructing experience, constructing psychology, constructing mental life, but kind of instead kind of supporting lawful properties that exist out in the world. So this is a kind of a classic new reductionist sort of perspective here. Thinking about the nervous system as a medium for law. Okay, laws that exist at all levels of nature, but can be revealed even in the nervous system. I think you're going to find this sort of thing really interesting. And this is an experiment that was, and actually these are still being conducted at University of Connecticut, but one of the first instances of this was a paper by Peter Kugler and Michael Turvey. And I was actually a subject in this experiment, so I can tell you how grueling it was. Here's what they were interested in. They were interested in limb coordination, whether it was people or animals or fishies. And, you know, we've got situations like this all the time, right? So when we walk, what we are doing is coordinating our arms with our legs. And as pendular devices, okay, our legs want to move slower than our arms because they're shorter and lighter, right? So my arm wants to move this fast, but my leg, which you can't see, pretend this is my leg now, wants to move this fast. But when we walk, we coordinate them. So this is just, you know, the natural physics, the natural kind of, you know, pendular physics of arms versus legs. Legs want to move slower. I mean, you know, legs will move slower because of the physical constraints. Arms will move faster. So what harnesses them? What allows them to be coordinated, right? And a scientist, a physiologist named von Holst, a long time ago, came up with this idea of what he called the magnet effect. And his research was mostly on fishies, which is why I have a little koi right there. And they have to coordinate their things all the time, right? They coordinate their little side fins with their little, with their bigger back fins, and the top fin is also smaller than the back fin, and that has to coordinate. So these are situations where, you know, things that naturally want to oscillate faster have to coordinate with things that naturally want to oscillate slower. And what he thought was that what happens is that through the nervous system, the slower thing kind of tries to draw the faster thing towards its tempo, and the faster thing, that fin on the back, wants to draw the larger thing, the tail fin, towards a faster tempo. So they're kind of trying to draw each other to each other's natural period, okay? But, you know, like magnets, and they'll end up on some sort of compromise. And he measured this and said, yeah, it's always a compromise. The faster thing's going slower and the slower thing's going faster. Cool. And so, you know, we have neurophysiological models for this, right? There's things called, you know, what are they called? Oscillating neurons to help with the oscillation. There's things called coordinating neurons. There's another type too, but that's the idea that you know, those coordinating neurons kind of reach a compromise. What Kugler and Turvey thought is, yes, that is one way of describing it, but we have another thing. We have a law that in fact tells us what happens when we rigidly connect pendula of different sizes. So in fact, it's a very useful law. Let's see if I can come up with something here. Yeah, so here's a pendulum right here. Just happen to have one right here. We can determine what this is, okay? This natural periodicity is. But then if we were to, how can I do this? Yeah. Say I use this thing now and bolt it. So this one has a different, this one's a little shorter, so it's going to have probably a faster periodicity, and this one has a longer periodicity. What I can do now is bolt these things together, and the physics of these materials will then allow for a prediction of what the ultimate frequency of swinging would be. So I connect it using this thing, which is great. By the way, it's called Huygens law, and you know, this is just portraying it here. If you have these individual components, you harness them together, you can then make predictions about what the ultimate frequency of swinging would be, which is cool, because then what you can do is you can take complex devices like this guy and consider, you know, make measurements and consider each of these things little components of an object, and come up with the ultimate periodicity of what it would be together. So it is a law that works, perfectly at predicting what kind of hard connected, welded, bolted together pendula will do, how they'll swing at the end. Okay, and it's based on the conservations of mass, if you're interested in that sort of thing. And don't worry about the virtual system idea. Basically, what it does is you take the, you just need to take the measurements of the weights and the lengths, and that the calculations allow you to kind of create a virtual singular pendular system, and that is what predicts the ultimate periodicity. So it's for hard connection pendulum swinging. Okay, but here's what Kugler and Turvey thought. What Huygens law does is it makes some predictions different from the magnet effect. And they wondered, maybe instead of the magnet effect where these neurons are talking to each other, we can consider that the nervous system might be harnessing Huygens law. Okay, because some interesting properties here. Okay, Huygens law makes some predictions that are not dependent on the kind of the swinging properties of these things, but are just dependent on the lengths and masses as determined by the conservation of mass, such that sometimes the coordinator, the I guess welded together frequency is actually slower than the slowest one. And sometimes, if they're very small, the welded together frequency of the group pendulum is faster than the fastest one. So in other words, where the magnet effect seems completely dependent on the natural periodicities of each of the components, Huygens law says sometimes it's going to be slower than the slowest one, and sometimes it's going to be faster than the fastest one. And now let's see what happens when we ask a person to coordinate pendula with their nervous system. Okay. So it's a much more complex sort of manipulation than Huygens was able to do with the fishies, right? And this is what I was doing. I sat in a chair and I swung a long pendulum with a heavy weight and a lighter pendulum, a shorter pendulum with a light weight, and was just told to coordinate them. Okay, make them set them up so they're coordinated. Usually it was out of phase like this. Do it so you coordinate them so you can do it as effectively, as efficiently as possible. If we ask you to do this for an hour, get the period that's most comfortable for you. And the question is, does von Holst's predictions, where it's dependent on a compromise between the fastest and the slowest, the natural periodicity of the fast one and the natural periodicity of the slow one, is that the predictor, or is it Huygens law? Which would be weird because we're not talking about pendula that are welded together or bolted together. Okay, they are just coordinated together through a soft tissue system, with the nervous system kind of working things. And what you find is that, as Huygens law would predict, sometimes the coordination between a light fast and a big slow pendulum, the coordinated tempo is slower than it would be for the long slowest one on its own. And sometimes it's faster than the smaller, faster one on its own. So as it turns out, Huygens law, this law derived for welded together, bolted together, rigidly connected pendula, does a better job and does an amazing job at predicting what a coordination through the nervous system in soft tissue would be like, which is absolutely amazing if you think about it. And this is what's meant by a medium for law, that the way to conceive of the nervous system from this perspective, right, at least with regard to this example, is say, maybe a lot of what the nervous system is doing is not like a kind of computer sort of communicating back and forth between, a controller here and a controller there and all that sort of thing, but it's just saying, hey, look, there's a law of nature that allows us to do this. I'm gonna, harness that law, however it does it, and take advantage of it. Wouldn't that be an efficient way to do it? Okay, it's kind of radical, but it gets more radical. I have a good buddy who is a contemporary of mine in graduate school who wanted to see whether this Huygens law that works within the nervous system can actually work between nervous systems. And what I mean by that is that he actually asked people to watch themselves and to coordinate while one was holding a short, light one and the other one was holding a long, heavy one, coordinating between people. And he found that, again, Huygens' law, this law for rigidly connected pendula works not just within the nervous system, but across nervous systems through the information that people are using, in this case, visual information that people are using to do this. So it's a very different way of kind of conceiving of the nervous system, right? It's a rejection of a computer metaphor and thinking of it as being a medium for things like emergent properties. The nervous system is thought to support, behaviors, including lawfully based behaviors, rather than producing behaviors. I have to end. Oh shoot! I'm gonna give you this slide. Oh shoot! I'm gonna give you this slide, and I'm gonna give you the paper, but this is a much more recent paper that discusses neurobehavioral dynamics between and within nervous systems, between people and within a single nervous system, where oscillatory aspects of cell groups are shown to coordinate with each other using some of the same principles that you see in coordination, between people and within pendular systems. And it's sometimes called a kind of systems dynamic approach to the nervous system, a dynamical systems approach to the nervous system. It's been used to describe a lot of recent observations. I should really end here. I won't hold you responsible for these details. I'll put up the paper you can look through the slide, but the details of this will absolutely not be on your test. Okay, sorry about that. I ran out of time, good. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and then good luck on the exam. I'll probably end up seeing and talking to you guys. I'll see you guys tomorrow, certainly. Look forward to hearing about your research. And feel free to contact me at any time, over the next 2 weeks. Okay? All right. See you guys. Take care.